Hello and welcome to the latest video on my channel. Today we'll build a full stack CRUD application using nextjs14, Prisma as our ORM, mongodb as our database, and we'll deploy it on vercel. So here we have a simple CRUD application that we're naming a personal task tracker. I currently have 2 tasks already within the database. So let's say we want to create a new task. We'll click on the new task button. From here, we have the ability to give our task a name, a brief description, set the priority, and we can toggle if it is complete or not. So I've added a name for our new task. I've added a description to our video next. Now I'll set the priority. And I'm going to mark that the video, and I'm going to mark that this task is currently not complete. So from here, we'll click on the Create Task button. We'll be redirected back to the home screen. And from here, we can see our new task listed within our homepage layout. If I wanted to update this task, I'll click on its name. From here, we'll be redirected to the edit/individual task route. And we're actually using the exact same form that we use to create a task. We're just conditionally rendering whether it is a new task or if it's an update to an existing task. So let's say we want to set the priority as high, and we'll add that we're going to deploy the video in the description. If we click on Update Task, we'll be redirected back to the home page. And as you can currently see, the priority changed to high. And if we click on the task name again, you see that it does contain Typescript and deploy, which is what we just updated. So this is a quick tutorial. We're going to jump straight in and get started. From here, I'm going to open the terminal and we'll type in the command npx create next app at latest, and space then dot so it is installed within the current directory. For this project, we're going to use Typescript. We'll say yes to ESLint, yes to Tailwind, no to SRC, yes to the app router, no to the import alias. Okay, once the installation is complete, before we clean up any of the files within our directories, let's go ahead and install Prisma. So within the terminal, go ahead and type in the command npm i-d and Prisma. And this is going to install Prisma as a development dependency. Next, we wanted to install the Prisma client, so we'll type npm i at Prisma, I forgot the P, /client, and press enter. Now we need to initialize Prisma and bring in a Prisma directory with the schema.prisma file. So we'll type in the command npx prisma init. And if you take a look at our root directory, you'll notice that we now have a schema.prisma file. So within it, let's go ahead and make a quick update. Instead of the database provider being PostgreSQL, let's remove it and type in mongodb and save the file. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and add in the model. This model is going to represent a task, and we're not going to have a lot of data stored within the task, but I do want to add a few things within it. And this model is going to represent the task that will be stored within our database. We'll begin by typing the word model, and we'll name this model task. And within it, we'll have an ID. The ID will be stored as a string. We want to say @ID. The default will pass in auto, which means that it'll auto increment. Then we want to map the ID. Of course, with MongoDB, this is going to be a database.objectID. The next field that we want within our task model is a name, and it will be a string. Then we'll include a description, and it will be a string as well, but we'll add a question mark. That way the description isn't necessarily required. We'll add a priority, and it will be a string. And I want to set the default to the priority to be low. That way it'll just have something as a default in the event we forget to toggle the field. We'll also have a completion field. The default for it will be false. Last but certainly not least, we want to have created at. And this will be date time. And of course, the default will be date. Default will be now. And underneath it, we also want updated at. And I just realized I forgot the D there. Sorry about that. We'll say date time. It will be at updated. Updated at. There we go. So let's go ahead and save this file, and that will complete the model. Next up, I want to update the .env file. By default, you'll notice that it already has a PostgreSQL URL, but of course, we're going to be using MongoDB. But before we update this file, let's go within the .gitignore and let's add .env to this file. The reason we're adding this is because I plan on deploying this project and I don't want to have our .env file listed within it. Although I am going to pull it down, it's just not a good best practice. If you plan on using this project yourself, please be sure to include your .env file within your .gitignore. We'll go ahead and close out that file and let's head over to mongodb.com. Once we're on the page, let's go ahead and log in. It's free to sign up if you don't already have an account. Once you're logged in, you want to go to the project window and let's create a new project. Feel free to name your project whatever you want, but I'm going to name mine Task Pro, which is going to be the name of our website. And I'm going to give permissions to the default user that's already logged in. Then we'll click on Create. For this project, the free tier will serve me just fine, but feel free to pick whatever tier you want. And be sure to select the region that's closest to you. Once this page looks good, click on Create Deployment. Next up, we'll be setting up the ability to connect to our cluster. Of course, we'll need a username and password. I'm going to use the password that's already provided by MongoDB, but feel free to change yours to something that you'll remember and that no one can easily guess. Once you have the password field appropriately updated, click on Create Database User. Then we'll click on Choose a Connection Method. Of course, we're going to use the MongoDB for VS Code. The selection Connect to your MongoDB deployment. Currently, it is showing the password, but what I want you to do is click on copy if you're following these steps. That way, you're grabbing the connection string that already has the password. You can just go ahead and paste it within your .env file. So now that we have this set up, we'll just go ahead and click on Done, and let's head back to VS Code. And as I just mentioned, we want to add this connection string to our database URL. At the end of the string, we want to include the database name, and for this project, I just kept the name as test. That's what it is by default. You didn't see me add it. I didn't cut it out or anything. That's the name by default, but you can always go in and change it to something more unique or personal. Feel free to customize it however you like. So next up, let's click Save and let's close out the .env file. We head back to the terminal. Next thing we want to do is push these updates to the database. So let's type in the command npx prisma db push. And if you set up everything successfully, you should see the message, your database indexes are now synced with your project. Let's click on Allow. And if you set everything up successfully, you should now see your database indexes are now in sync with your Prisma schema. And then finally, what we want to do is type in npx prisma generate. And just to make sure that the changes went through successfully, if we go back to mongodb.com and click on database, then we'll click on browse collections. We should see that we have the test database, which is the name of our database. And under it, we have the schema, which is task. So perfect. We now have a connection from our Nextjs project to our MongoDB cluster using Prisma. Let's go ahead and clean up our app a little bit, set up the layout, our CRUD operations next. So now that we have Prisma installed, the next thing we want to do before we begin to focus on our app directory and the functionality of our website is add a function that's going to allow us to utilize the Prisma client, which is going to help us grab the model or the schema that we just created and have full functionality to all the CRUD operations in order to successfully create our project. So let's go ahead in the terminal and type in npm run dev just to go ahead and run our server on localhost. And we can go ahead and close the terminal out and go back to the root directory. Within it, let's add a folder named lib. And within lib, let's add a file named prisma.tsx. Within this file, we're going to store the Prisma client. Basically, what we have within this file is the ability to connect to our database using Prisma. And this function is going to give us access to our task model. And with the access to that task model, we're going to use Prisma and gain the ability to create all of the CRUD functionalities. If there's not a connection, we're going to establish one and perform these tasks in the most efficient manner possible. So once you have this code within your file, go ahead and save it and close it out. Now we'll go ahead and begin to focus on the app directory, which is the main directory that we're going to focus on for this project. The first thing I want to do is update the fave icon within the app directory. So on my local machine, I actually went to faveicon.io and created a custom fave icon so that I didn't have to use the one from Next. Feel free to use this one. I'm going to have the link in the description below. You can also create your own. I'll include the link to the website, and I probably already have it on the screen as well. Or you could just keep the same fave icon that's there. It's not going to impact the project. I just want to add one just for my own personal preference. So I'm going to grab what I have on my local machine and drag it over to the app folder. Then you get the message asking if you want to replace it. And of course, I'm going to click on replace. And we see the fave icon that I have within the project listed on the screen. So we'll close it out. Next, within the global.css file, let's remove the boiler code that's listed within it. And we can save this file. Just don't delete the Tailwind configuration because we are going to use Tailwind CSS within this project. And now we can close out the global.css file. Next up, we have our layout.tsx. What I want to do right now is change the font from Enter to Poppins. So we'll go ahead and remove Enter within the import and type in Poppins. And we're going to remove the Enter listed within this as well and replace it with Poppins. Let's go down to the body and replace the Enter with Poppins that we just added. And then last but not least, we'll need to add a weight. So if we go back to the object, we'll just bring in weight. And we're going to set the weight to 400. Let's click Save, and we can close out the layout.tsx file. Last but not least, let's go to the page.tsx. And then once we've removed that code, let's replace it with the new component named homepage. Click Save, and let's go back to our local host just to see what we have. And as you can see, we currently have, and as you can see within our local host, we have local. And as you can see within our local host, we see homepage on the screen with the default style and page.tss code removed. So as you can see within our local host, we have the default CSS styling removed, and we only see homepage on the screen. Great. So if we go to our deployed website, we'll notice that the web page and the content within it is centered on the screen. So we'll need to have a way to make sure that we have all of our content centered, padding, and the margin is the same on both sides. So back within VS Code, within the root directory, let's add a folder named components. And within it, I'm going to add a file named box.tsx. Within this file, let's go ahead and start out by creating a component. And I'm going to make or name it box with a capital B. And we'll want to pass in children. We specify the children. It is going to be read only. And we'll have less than bracket, pass in the JavaScript brackets, and we'll say children. React node, and then inside of the div we'll replace box with children. Sorry, I just realized I misspelled children there. There we go. And inside of the div we'll give the div a class name, and we want to set the max width first. It doesn't really matter, but I just want to go ahead and get it out of the way. We'll set the max width to large. That way it only takes up a certain width of the screen. and we'll use MX Auto to center it. And I want to add a little bit of padding based on the size of the window. So we'll say on an extra large device, we'll set the padding on the X to 20. On a medium device, we'll set the padding on the X to 10. On a small device, we'll set the padding on the X to 2. And by default, we'll set the padding on the X to 4. Great. So now let's go ahead and save this file. So now that we have this saved, let's go ahead and update our home page. We'll start by removing this div and adding another div and giving it a class name of padding on the Y of 6. And just to test out the box, we're going to import it by using the less than bracket capital BOX, and just be sure to bring it in from @/component/box. And within this box, we'll add a home page. And if we go back to our local host, you'll see that we now have padding listed on the side, which means that the box is working, and we should be able to provide this consistently on the pages and the header. That way we have that consistent padding throughout the web page. Great. So first thing we want to do is add in. So next up within our layout, let's go ahead and add in a header. So within the components directory, let's add a file named header.tsx. Oh, sorry, I misspelled it there. TSX. And we'll add the RFCE template and update the header so that it has a capital H. And just to get something on the screen, well, before we add something on the screen, let's go ahead and remove this div and replace it with header. And we'll give header a class name of padding on the Y of 6. Within the header, let's add in the box. And because it is within this components directory, it's going to be from /. And within this box, if we look at our site, we notice that we have text on the box. It looks like a header text and a description text. So let's go ahead and add in a text. So instead of hard coding it directly within the header, I'm going to add a separate component and bring that text in separately. Within the components directory, let's add a file named heading-text.tsx. We'll go ahead and add a functional component, and we'll say heading text. We'll save this. And for right now, let's go back to the header.tsx file and let's bring in the heading text that we just created. Save this file. And now so that we can get something displayed onto the screen, let's go back to the layout.tsx file. And within the body tag, let's bring in the header that we just created. And it should be just above the children, but of course within the body tag. Let's save this file and go to our local host just to see what it looks like. You'll notice that we have heading text at the top, and below it we have our home page. So now let's go ahead and style the heading text. So within the heading text.tsx file, what we're going to pass to it is a title and description. And if we define this, we'll say a title is a string and description is also a string. Okay. Now let's remove the heading text within the div tag. And within the div, let's give it a class name of flex and set the direction to column. We want to have an H1 as the title. So we'll set the class name and say on small devices, we want the text to be 3XL. By default, we want it to be set to 2XL. We'll set the font to medium. We'll set the font to medium. We'll call this a title font. The text color will be gray, and we'll set it to 900. and we'll give this a margin bottom of 1. Let's close up this H1 and pass in title. If we save this file, let's go back to the title text and let's add a title. We'll say Task Pro. And let's just go ahead and give it a description as well. We'll call it ranked number 1. And make this a lowercase number n, number 1 website to manage your personal task. We'll click save and we'll go back to the heading text.tsx. Now let's add a p tag, which will be for the description. We'll give it a class name. We'll set the text to base. We'll say leading relax. We'll set the text to purple. And I want to make it purple 500. Let's close this p tag and pass in description. And for right now, we can go ahead and close out the layout.tsx, and we actually can close out the heading text as well. If we save you'll see that we have the Task Pro title and also the description, but it looks like I added an extra character. So let me go back to the heading text and see what's going on. After the H1, I added a slash. Let me remove it, save the file, close out the heading text, and go back to the local host. Great. Now you see that it is no longer there. So now that we have this set up, the next thing I want to set up with our layout. So now that we have that set up, the next thing that I want to add is the sub nav bar, or the additional nav, you would say, that has a smaller title and a description. And it looks like we have a flex box. We have the direction set to justify between. And we have a new task button that's going to allow us to click on it, and it's going to redirect us to the /new route. So let's go ahead and head back to VS Code. The first thing I want to do is add in the /new route. The way we do so with Next.js is within the app directory, and with this, with Next.js, we have a file-based routing system. So within app, if we add a folder named new, and within it, add a file named page.tsx. Just to get something on the screen, we can add the RFCE template, and we'll name this component new task page, this page component, excuse me. Click save, and let's just go back to localhost and add the /new. So we'll say localhost 3000 /new. And you see that it redirects us to the new page. Great. So now back in the text editor, let's close out the header.tsx because we no longer need it. And we're going to add this file, or we're going to add this code to our home page. So let's remove the home page text. And within the box, let's add a div. And we're going to give it a class name of flex. We'll set the items to be centered. Set the width to full, and we'll add justify between. Then let's add a div. This div is going to hold the header text and description that's right below it. And then outside of the div, we can actually go ahead and add it in now if you want. We'll just go ahead and add a link. And this is going to come from next/link. And the href for it will be /new. And within it, we'll just add in new text, or new task, I should say, excuse me. We'll click save, and let's go back to the empty div that we created and add in the H1. We'll give it a class name of text XL. We'll say the font is medium. Let's set the text color to gray, and we'll make it 800. And I think that'll be all. Let's go ahead and close up this H1, and I'm just going to put task within it. Hit save, and underneath the H1, let's add a p tag and give it a class name of font light. And we'll set the text to gray 400, which is a lighter shade, and we want the text size to be medium. Click save, and we'll see. We'll add in see all tasks listed below. Go ahead and click save, and let's go back to our local host. Great. Now you see we have the H1 and description right underneath it, and in a flex box with justified space between, we have the new task button, and if we click on it, it's going to redirect us to the new task page. So let's go ahead and begin to style this and set up the new task functionality. So back in our text editor, so back in the root directory, let's click on app, and within app, click on new, which is the new directory, and we want to access the page.tsx file. Let's remove the existing div and replace it with a section tag. We'll give it a class name of py6, which is going to represent padding on the Y. And within it, let's add a box, and be sure to import it from @/components. Inside of it, we'll add a div, and we'll give it a class name of width full. We'll set the flex direction to column. And within it, we'll give a H1. And I don't think we're going to add anything to this H1. Let's just put new task as the H1. Actually, let's use the exact same styling we have on the home page. So I'm just going to copy it. And we probably should have just made this a reusable component as well, but it's okay. And within the H1, we'll just paste in the code that we had there. And then now let's add a P tag. I'm going to put add new task below. Hit save. Go back to the page.tsx and just copy the class name for the description because we want it to be the same. And let's add it to the P tag on the new task page, paste it in. And now let's go back to the local host just to see what we have. And as you can see, we now have the padding on the left and right. You can't really see it on the right, but trust me, it's there. But more importantly, underneath it, we see the new task title and description listed right below it. Great. So if we take a look at the new task page on our deployed website, we'll see that we have a form, and it looks like it has a different width size, and we have a name, description, priority, and we have the ability to toggle if it is complete or not. And right below it, we have a create task button. So let's go ahead and build that out. But before we build it out, we'll need to have some functionality that's going to allow us to query our database. We'll need to have some functionality that's going to allow us to connect to the database. But before we set that up, we'll need to have some functionality that's going to allow us to capture the data from our front end, query our database, and make an update to it based on the information that we're passing to it. So let's go back to the text editor. And within the root directory, we want to look for the folder named lib. And within it, let's add a folder named actions. And the first action that we're going to create is add task. So we're going to add a file named add-task.tsx. Okay, so within the add-task.tsx, what we want to do is have the ability to access the Prisma client. Within it, we'll grab the task model, and we want to have the ability to add the task information that we're getting from our form data. So we'll start by setting this file as use server. Then we'll want to import Prisma. Next, we're going to bring in redirect from next navigation. That way, if everything is successful, we want to redirect back to the home page. Then we're going to create an asynchronous function named create task. And within it, we want to pass in form data, and the type will be form data, of course. Then we want to create a variable named name, which will get the name from the form data, and we want to set it to a string. We'll do the same for description, priority, and also completion. And just for some validation, we'll say if we don't get all of this information, we just want to send an error by clicking return. Next, we'll create a variable named new task. And within it, it's going to access Prisma, specifically the task model. Then we want to access .create. And based on the data that we get, we want to pass in name, description, priority, and completion. And then if all goes well, we want to redirect the user back to the home page. Now, if you notice, we're getting an error on priority. And if we take a look at it, it's saying that the priority does not exist. So if we go back to our schema.prisma file, the reason it's saying it doesn't exist because I misspelled it. So my apologies. So I'm going to go back and copy this priority, add it to the schema file. We'll click save. And since we updated the schema file, we'll need to go back to the terminal, stop our current local host, and then type in the command npx prisma db push. We didn't get any errors, so that's great. Then after that, we want to type in npx prisma generate. Great. And now you notice that we're no longer getting the error. So we can close out the add task action, the schema.prisma file. And for right now, we'll close out the page.tss for the home page. We'll go ahead and close out all of our existing files. And let's go back to, I'll tell you what, before we go back to the new page, let's click on components. And let's add a file named task-form.tsx. And for right now, I'm just going to add in the RFCE template because I actually want to add this to the new page. And I'm going to name this task form. So we're actually going to conditionally render this form. If we have a task, we want the ability to use this form to update the task. And if we don't have one, we want to have the ability to add a task. So for right now, let's go back to the page.tsx that's within the new directory. And underneath the p tag, let's bring in the form that we just created. And the name of it was task form. Now we'll need to go back to the terminal and type in the command npm run dev just to get our server back up and going. Once our local host is up and going, we'll see that we now have the task form on the new route. So we have access to that task form. So let's go ahead and begin to add some functionality so that we'll have the ability to create a new task. So before we update the code within the task form, let's just go ahead and add in the additional action to update a task. So within the lib directory, within actions, let's add a file named updatetask.tsx. So within this file, we're going to add the ability to update a task. This code is going to be very similar to the new task code. So let's just go ahead and begin to type it out. First, we'll add the use server at the top of the file. Then we want to bring in Prisma. We'll also bring in redirect from next navigation once we've successfully updated the task. Then we'll create a asynchronous function named update task and pass in the form data. Based on the form data that we get, we'll need to pass in the ID, the name, description, and priority and completion. The big difference between the new form and the update form is that we do need to pass in the ID. That way we have the ability to grab the task by the ID. And notice that we made everything a string within the schema.prisma file. So we want to make sure that we're adding toString at the end of the form data, because remember, it gets passed over as an object. We'll add some simple validation saying that if we don't get this information, then we're not going to be able to update the file. We're not going to be able to update the task. Then underneath it, we want to establish the connection to Prisma. Specifically, we want to get the task schema and we want to access update. Within it, we want to grab the ID that we passed in through the form data. And then the data that we want to pass in that we're destructuring is the name, description, priority, and if it is complete. And then last but not least, we want to redirect, provided that we don't get any errors with this connection. Now let's go ahead and save this file and go back to the task form. So within this task form, I want to start out by just having a clean file. And let's go ahead and begin to build it out. First, I'm going to bring in create task. that we just created. Then I'm also going to bring in update task because without it, the form won't function properly. Next, we'll need to bring in the task from the Prisma client, which is going to give us access to that model. And of course, we'll need React. Then we're going to create or bring back the task form export default function. Be sure to pass in task and specify if we have a task, we'll display the data. Otherwise, we're just going to show task. And within the task form, we're going to pass in the task itself. Now we'll create a variable named form action saying that if we have a task in ID, we know that it is update task. If it is not, then it's going to be create task. Let's add in our return statement. Then in it, we'll need a div. And for styling purposes, I'm going to give it a class name with a little bit of padding. And because we're not using any client-side code in this project, the form will need to submit an action. And I added some styling on the y-axis. Within the form, the main piece is the action, and we want to pass in the function action that we just created. We'll add an input that'll be hidden, and we'll give it a name of an ID. And by default, if there's a task, we want to pass in the ID, and we want to make it a string. So within the form, after the hidden input, the first input we want to pass in is for the task name. If there's already an existing task, we want to display the name of it. Otherwise, we want to set this input's name to name. Make sure the type is text. We've already went over the default value. And because this is required, we want to make sure that we have the user enter this information and they can't move forward without it. Last but not least, I have a class name just for some simple styling. Underneath it, we'll add another div. We'll give it a label or description, add a text area. We'll give it a label of description. This will be a text area so that we can type in more information for the description should we choose. The name will be description. We'll give it a placeholder of description of your task. That could be whatever you want. The default value, if there's a description, we want to display it. Otherwise, we want to display an empty string. Our text area is going to have 3 rows, and I add some styling to it just so that it will look a little better than it would without the styling. Next up, we have priority. Priority is going to be a select option. So we'll start with the label, just setting it to priority. Then we'll give it select. Within it, we'll pass in options. The value for the options will be low, medium, and high. Select will have a name of priority. We'll give it a default value of task.priority if there's already a task in place. And of course, we have a class name for some styling. And then last but not least, underneath this div, we'll add another div for input. This one will have a type of a checkbox. If it is complete, you'll check it. Otherwise, you'll leave it blank. And remember, we set the default value to false. And because it is false, we're going to say that it is not complete, and we're going to distinguish that within the project later on. We gave it a class name just for some style, and we have the label listed underneath the div or underneath the input within the div, and you'll see why in a moment. Then we'll need a way to submit this information to the database. Of course, we have a button. We'll give it a type of submit with a class name, but more importantly, within the button, if there's a task ID, we want to show update task. Otherwise, we want to show create task. So let's just go ahead and save this file and test it out. So if we go back to the local host /new, we see that we have the new task form filled out and displayed. So I'm just going to type in a task. We'll set the priority to medium, and we'll keep the completion open, and let's click on create task. What should happen based on the code that we have is it should redirect us to the home page if everything goes successfully. And as you can see, it has redirected us to the home page. Now let's go to our MongoDB cluster just to see if it was added to the database. If we update the page and click on task, you see the task that we just created. Now I want to see if the update functionality works. So let's copy the object ID that we have listed here on the screen, and we'll head back to VS Code. the first thing we'll need to do is create a update or edit task route. So within the app directory, if you recall, this is where all of our routing takes place. I'm going to add in a folder directly within app named edit. And then within it, I'm going to add a folder named ID, but the ID is going to be wrapped in brackets. So we'll say open bracket, ID, close bracket. Then within it, I'm going to add a file named page.tsx. So we see that the route for this page is going to be edit/ID. Let's go ahead and go to it on our local host. And I know right now it's not going to show anything because we technically haven't added any code to it just yet. But I'll tell you what, let's just go ahead and add in the snippet and we'll call this page update task. Hit save. Now let's go back to our local host and let's go to /edit/ID. So we'll say localhost /edit. And let's add in the ID that we just created. If we hit enter, we see that we see update task on the screen, so that's perfect. Now let's remove the code in the update task. Should have the ability to update our task since we've already created the server action and our form is currently created. I'm going to start by bringing in box just so that for styling purposes and the task form for the actual functionality to update the task. Then we'll bring in Prisma. We'll also bring in redirect from next navigation. Then we'll create the update task export default function. Within it, we want to pass in params. And as we destructure it, remember this is going to be a string. Then within it, we want to create a variable named task, which will look for the unique task by the ID that we created. So we'll say params.id, which will give us access to that ID. And if we say, or if there for some reason we don't have a task, we want to redirect the user back to the home page. Then within the return statement, we'll add a div with a class name for some styling. We'll add the custom box or the reusable component box for styling. Then within it, we want to pass in the task form. And because there is a task, we want to pass in the actual task within the task form. So now if we click save, as you can see, we're on the localhost /edit/ID page, and we're passing in the name of the task, the description, the priority that we created, and we see that it is not completed. So I'm just going to add something to this just to make sure that it worked. First, so we'll say, here's our first description, and it's updated. And let's set the priority to high. And if we click on update task, you'll see that we're redirected back to the home page. Now to make sure that it works properly, let's go to localhost /edit/the unique ID. And as you can see, the description is now showing it's updated. The priority is set to high. And if we go to the MongoDB cluster, you'll see that those changes are now reflected in the database as well. So now that we have the ability to create and update a task, let's go ahead and add in the ability to display the task, and we're going to add that to the home page. We'll add in a task card, which has some unique functionality and some reusable components. We'll add the ability to delete a task, and then that will complete out the CRUD functionality. So the first thing I want to do is go ahead and build out the priority.tsx component. If we take a look at our deployed site, what we'll be building is this layout that what we'll be building is the strip and the color of the priority, and we'll be displaying the name of the priority in a column. So we're going to build out that functionality first. The first thing we'll want to do is bring in task from the Prisma client. Then we'll create a export default of priority, and we'll pass in task, and it will be a string. And we'll have access to the ID, the name, description, priority, and all of the information that goes along with the schema model, but we're only going to use the priority within this file. Then we'll create a variable named getColorClass, and we're going to use some good old-fashioned JavaScript, a switch statement, and we're going to pass in the task.priority. And what this is saying is that if the priority is high, we want the background to be red 200. If it is medium, we want it to be yellow 200. If it is low, we want it to be green. And by default, the color will be set to gray. Then inside of the return statement, we'll have a div. And notice that we're passing in the temporal literals. The direction is a flex column with a little bit of padding. We set the height to full. We want the information to be centered, and we want to make sure all of the characters are aligned. And then dynamically, we're going to pass in and call the getColors function that we just created. Within the div, we'll add a p tag, and this is where we're going to display each character of the priority. So the first one is going to be 0, and then we'll have 1, 2, 3. And because the longest case is medium, I'll need to pass in at least 5 p tags with priority. That way we'll display all of the characters of the priority in the event the user, or in the event we create a medium priority. So I'm going to go ahead and add those now. And I added 6 just for good measure, but technically 5 would have been just fine. Go ahead and save this file and close it out. Next up, we want to care for the ability to delete a task. So before we set this up, we'll need to create the delete task functionality within our server action. So within the root directory, let's click on lib, then actions, and within the actions folder, let's add a file named delete task.tsx. So within this file, we want to build out the action that'll give us the ability to delete a task based on the form data ID that's passed in from the user. So we'll start by marking the file as use server, and bring in Prisma. We'll also use revalidate from nextcache, which will validate the data that we have. And because Next.js does a great job of caching, we can utilize the revalidate path just to do a quick revalidation of what data we have sent or what data we're getting from the server. Then we'll create an asynchronous function, and we're going to name it delete task, and we're going to pass in the form data. We'll add a try catch block. That way, if we get an error or we're not able to successfully delete the task, we want to know why, and we'll pass it to the console. Within the try block, we'll create a variable named task ID, and it will be set to the form data ID that we get, and be sure to convert it to a string. If there's no task ID, we just want to return that, hey, there's no ID. Next up, we want to await the connection to Prisma. Then we'll want to gain access to the .delete functionality from Prisma, and we want to delete the task based on the ID that we're getting from the form data. And remember, we created the variable named task ID. And this is pretty simple. In the event it doesn't work, we want to console.log the error. And of course, we want to revalidate that path just in case. We want to revalidate the path if everything goes well. That way we no longer see that task within our task layout, and we know that it is successfully deleted. So let's go ahead and save this file and go back to the delete task.tsx. This file is within the components, so we'll go ahead and build out this component now. So within the components directory, let's go ahead and build out the delete task component. We'll start by bringing in the delete task action that we just created. Then we'll access tasks from the Prisma client. And last but not least, we'll want to access, or we'll want to utilize a React icon. The reason we're getting this error is because we have not installed the module just yet. So let's go ahead and update it now. Within the terminal, type in the command npm I react-icons and press enter. And once it's complete, you can hit save, and you should no longer see the error. Now we want to create a export default named delete task, and be sure to pass in the task. We'll have access to all of its properties, but that's okay. We're just going to utilize the ID. Then inside of the return statement, we want to use a form and gain access to the action. And the action that we want is the delete task action that we just created. Within the form, we'll have an input. The type will be hidden because the user doesn't need to see the ID. Be sure to set the name and ID to ID, and the default value will be task.id, which will be sending to our delete task action, and it'll be destructured from the form data that's sent to it. Finally, we'll add a button with a type of submit, and within it, we'll pass in the FI trash icon that we created. And I just added some styling to it. That way, when we hover over it, we'll see a shade of red, and we'll also set the height and the width to 4. Now let's go ahead and close out the delete task component, and we'll shift our focus to the task card. So as I look back on our task, I see that we have a button. I see that we also have the ability to display if the task is open or complete. So let's go ahead and set up a completion component. That way we can render this unique output if the task is open or if it's complete. Within the components directory, let's add a file named completion.tsx. So within this file, we'll start by bringing in the task from Prisma/client. Then we'll create a component named completion. And of course, we'll pass in the task as we've done with the other components. Within it, we'll have a return statement. I'm going to give it a span with some styling. And for this project, I'm just going to pass in the word open. Let's go ahead and save the file. Now we'll shift our focus to the task card. We'll start by bringing in the Prisma client, and of course that will be task. We'll use link from NextLink to help us with our client-side routing. Next, we want to bring in the priority component, completion component, and delete task component that we just created. Our component name will be task card that we'll eventually utilize to import within the home page. Within it, we'll have a return statement. The first div will have a class name of flex, and we want the items to be centered, and we'll add a little border to this just for styling and some padding on the X and Y. Then we want to utilize the priority component, and of course we need to pass in task in order for it to display the priority and the appropriate color. Then underneath it, we'll add a flex div. We'll add a div with a class name of flex. We want the items to be spaced out between each other. This particular div is going to take up the full width because it's what's going to hold the name and also the ability to delete this task. The first div within the flex box will have a flex of column. This is going to show the name of the task in addition to the whether it is complete or not. Notice that we have the link to edit/task.id. So if we want to update this task, we'll click on the name of it, and that'll redirect us to the individual task page. Outside of that div, we'll create a new div, and we'll have it flex with the item centered and give it a little bit of padding on the X. It's going to show whether the task is completed, and it'll also give the user the ability to delete the task in the event they no longer wish to see it. Now let's go ahead and save this file and close it out. And then last but not least, let's go back to our page.tsx, and let's go ahead and add in the ability to display the tasks that are within our database. So first, let's mark this file as asynchronous because this will be an asynchronous function. And then underneath the return statement and outside of the brackets for this home page component, let's add a new component named async function, and it is going to be task list. Now within this file, we want the ability to display our task. Within this file, we want the ability to make the connection to Prisma and display all of our tasks in a grid layout. So we'll go ahead and begin by typing const task, which will be the variable that'll hold all of our tasks. And we'll say await Prisma. This is going to come from the lib directory, and we'll say .task because that's the name of the schema. And we want to find many. And we'll click save. Then inside of the return statement, let's pass in a div. This first div is going to set up the layout of our task card that we'll bring in just a second. So on small devices, we want to have one grid column. On medium devices, we want to have 2. We'll give it a little bit of gap. So we'll say gap of 2. We'll add a border and we'll set the padding on the X and Y to 2. Now within the div, we want to map over all of the tasks within the task variable. So we'll say task.map and be sure to include the S or whatever you decided to name this variable. And within it, we'll pass in, and within it for each of the tasks, we want to assign it a name of task. And we want to return the task card that we just created. And as you begin to type out the capital TASK, be sure that you're importing it from @/components/task-card. And then within the task card, we'll need to pass in a key. That will be the task.id. Then we'll need to also pass in task. And within task, we'll be passing in task. All right, so now the last thing we want to do is I'm just going to create or add in suspense. And suspense is basically, and I'll talk about it more in a different video. I didn't want to have this video too long, just wanted to show a simple CRUD application that was strictly server rendered. But basically what suspense is, it'll allow us to show a loading state while we're in the process of fetching the task from the server or whatever data we're getting from the server. So underneath the last closing div that is above the new task, let's add in a less than sign and begin to type out suspense with a capital S. And we should have the ability to import it from React. Then we'll say fallback. And the fallback that we want to pass in is loading. Then we'll close up suspense. And then once it is done showing loading, what we eventually want to see is the task list. Now, if we save this file and go back to our local host, you'll see that we have the ability to see the task displayed in a grid. Let's go ahead and add one more task just to make sure that everything is still functioning properly. So we'll click on New Task, and let's give this task a name. And for this one, we'll set the priority to high. Let's click on Create. Great, so we see the tasks are displayed on the screen. And let's make sure that we have the ability to see the individual task by clicking on the task name. As you see, it is showing the individual task within the update form. And we see the name, description, and priority being passed through. So I'll just add a S to the end of task and click on Update. Now let's see if we have the ability to delete a task. Once we clicked on the delete icon, we no longer see the recently added task. So now that we have the full CRUD functionality in place, let's go ahead and deploy our project. First up, what we want to do is go back to VS Code and click on source control. Well, I'll tell you what, before we click on source control, let's go to the page.js file. Or excuse me, the package.json file, sorry. And after scripts, let's add a comma. And then we want to add in post install, and we want it to be Prisma generate. This way we'll be able to access Prisma in a deployed environment or production environment, I should say. Make sure you save this file and close it out. Then let's go back to source control and let's type in first commit. Then we want to publish this branch. Excuse me. I'm going to make this public because I'm going to share this repo with you, but feel free to make yours private if you like. Head back to vercel, and now we want to click on add new. And of course, we want to add a new project. And it may take a moment, but you should see the new repo that you just created. Let's click on import. It's going to ask you the project name. Leave it as is. I'm just going to keep the same project name. It's going to ask the framework. The important piece here is the environment variables. And we'll need to paste those in, and it'll have the database connection to MongoDB. Go to the .env file. Let's copy the database URL, and we'll paste it into the key. Now we're going to initially get an error, but we're going to go ahead and click deploy, and I'm going to show you how to fix that. So as you see, we're getting an error in the build logs, and the reason why is because it's not able to find any of the tasks that we are invoking. That is because we need to integrate our MongoDB database. So if we click on back, and if we click on my team, so if we click on my team, next to overview, we have integrations. And what we want to integrate is the MongoDB Atlas. So we'll click on view. Then we'll click on add integration. Next, it's going to ask us to select an account with Vercel. So just be sure that you're selecting the appropriate name of the account that you have with Vercel. And next, we want to specify a specific project. The project that we're going to select is Type Nextjs14. Then we'll click on install. It'll ask us to create or log in with our account for MongoDB. So let's go ahead and log in. It'll ask you to confirm the organization. I only have one organization set up, so it should be defaulted to that one if you have just one organization set up as well. Then click continue. And if we scroll down, we just need to acknowledge that we're giving Vercel access to our Atlas organization. And we'll click I acknowledge. Then we'll need to select the project. And the name of this project for me is Task Pro. And last but not least, once you acknowledge that you understand this is necessary for Vercel deployment, click on connect and return to Vercel. Then you should be redirected to the MongoDB Atlas, and you should see configure on the right. Now, if we click on overview and go back to the project that we were attempting to deploy, we'll click on deployments. So with this, we'll need to attempt to redeploy this project with the updated changes. So we'll click on redeploy, and we'll click on redeploy. And once it's complete, you should see the status of ready. And if we click on the first link, that's going to be the URL of our website. And as you can see, we are deployed, and we have our project that we have within our local host now deployed on Vercel. So let's just test it out. Let's click on new task, and let's give it a name and description. We'll set the priority high, and then we'll click create task. And as you can see, it redirected us back to the home page, and we see the newly added task. Now let's just confirm that we have the ability to delete. So I'll click on delete, and we no longer see that task. And if we click on the name deployed, it's going to redirect us to the edit/task ID page. And I'm just going to add something else to make sure that edit work, and we'll be all set. So I'm just going to add two S's, or excuse me, I'm going to add two S's and click on update task. And as you can see, it is showing the two S's, excuse me. So the CRUD functionality is up and working. So listen, I hope you enjoyed today's video. This was just a quick CRUD tutorial using strictly server components and with a connection to Prisma and MongoDB deployed on Vercel. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please consider subscribing and give it a like. Any suggestions, leave it in the comments below. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. Love you, man.